Great. Okay, so yes, thanks very much, Vanessa. As she said, I'm James Bullock, and I'm going to give a talk today on thoughts I've been developing the last year or couple of years on basically how we do conservation in a rapidly changing world. And I should emphasize, maybe provocative is too strong a word. I'm aiming to explore what we might do about this changing world and how we have to adapt conservation to it. So I'm going to set out the problem and some ways towards a solution, but certainly I don't expect to be giving you the full solution, but maybe to stimulate some debate and thoughts about it. So yeah, that's me. That's why I'm calling it a personal view, not all the answers. So I'm sure you don't need reminding that biodiversity is declining and is now declining quite fast. The IPBES, or IPBES, how you want to pronounce it, calculated there's about 1 million species threatened globally. And this is mostly not to do with climate change, but due to other things such as land use degradation and conversion, overexploitation of the oceans, invasive species, etc. And that 1 million species is out of a very rough estimate of 8.1 million, so quite a large proportion. And that's a global figure. As we know within Britain, I'm going to focus a bit on Britain here today. We're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And you can see that in the bottom of this slide here, where work we've done on a much smaller scale compared to global, the relatively small county of Dorset on the south coast of England, where we've shown that semi-natural habitats such as calcareous grasslands, broadleaf woodlands, heathlands have massively declined in less than a century. Nearly 90% of the semi-natural habitat has gone. So we've seen huge declines and rather accelerated declines over the recent past. This, as I say, won't be news to you, but it's a bit of background. And the huge threat biodiversity is facing now and more into the future is climate change. It's an interesting area because there's been some recent papers saying, oh, why does everyone focus on climate change when land use change is the big killer? Well, climate change is only really just kicking in, and it's the future that we really ought to be concerned about. And this is captured in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recent Working Group 2 report. You can see the name of it in blue here, where they try to bring together the latest evidence on various aspects of the impacts of climate change. And they brought together various bits of information to come up with these figures. You can see this rather weird figure with the writing across it. This is because this is their draft report. It's not even finalized yet, so really hot off the press. But they estimated from a range of sources the sort of figures for extinction we might expect over up to about 2100 based on as the various estimates. And it depends really where you sit on how far we're going to go with climate change, but you see the figures, the medians, ranging from 9% to 15% of species. So that's equivalent to that million I showed you in the previous slide. But you see the maximum numbers, they're quite terrifying. I'm not sure how much credence we can place on those, but they are a huge, huge proportion. As well as those sort of take-home numbers, this also points to the uncertainty, which I'll return to in a minute. But I think even if we're not clear about the exact numbers here, this suggests a huge ongoing threat to biodiversity, which we're only just starting to see realized now. And those sort of take-home numbers will be exacerbated by a number of different factors. So those figures I've just shown you tend to think about threats to individual species based on which part of the climate envelope they can live in, etc. But if we know species don't live on, no species is an island, I guess you could put it. Species live with each other in negative and positive ways, as food, as competitors, as mutualists. And if we consider those assemblages, this really important paper published a couple of years ago now in Nature said, well, what if we consider the assemblages, the groups of species, and the fact that if they start losing some species from them, those assemblages are under threat and we may get cascading extinctions. And so this is even worse, that it may be sort of secondary effects of climate change as you lose the species you feed on or interact with, that may exacerbate that problem. And their calculation was under the most extreme climate projection of so-called RCP 8.5, they said 81% of terrestrial assemblages will lose at least one species before 2100. And you can see the threat is mostly around the equator. Even us here up north, there's quite a high risk. Another exacerbating factor is something I work on, dispersal ability. So a lot of the calculations are based on assuming species can move to new climate space, and the fact that even with that, their climate space may not exist anymore. If we include the process by which species need to be able to move to that new climate space as even more of a problem. And this is what we looked at a few years ago for mammals. You think, well, mammals, they're pretty good at moving around, and they're one group that should be able to keep up with climate change. And this keeping up with climate change is something can be looked at through something called the velocity of climate change. So if you think of climate as moving polewards under climate change, the individual species need to move polewards with their climate space in order to keep from going extinct. And we put together data on the demography, the population dynamics of species, and their known dispersal abilities to calculate that nearly 30% of mammal species would not be able to keep up with climate change. I think, again, I would emphasize, I wouldn't place too much credence on that exact number, because there are lots of unknowns here about climate change, about a lack of knowledge about true dispersal abilities, etc. But it's more of a pointer towards the fact that dispersal is really important, and that even well-dispersed species like mammals, a lot will have problems in keeping up with climate change. Well, of course, the politicians and the international agreements to say, well, don't worry, we've got climate change in hand. We've had COP26. We're going to move towards net zero. We'll keep a control on climate change. But I think by all indicators, it's not looking great. This is a diagram by Climate Action Tracker, which I would just emphasize, this is not some radical group of people who say were headed to hell in a handcart, if that's the right expression. They've analysed the various policies and the IPCC scenarios to look at what they may mean in terms of climate change. And to be honest, I was pointed towards this figure by an eminent climate scientist, who said it was a very useful way of looking at it. So I'm just emphasising that. And they calculate that under current policies, we're headed towards a median of about 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which is where, you remember, the Paris Agreement goal was about 1.5 degrees. So that's massively more. There are various other policy scenarios, which you can see in these different colors here, which may mean we keep to a lesser degree of climate change. But even their optimistic scenario, where everyone does what they say they're going to do and they're all done in time, that's the optimistic scenario, and I would say extremely optimistic scenario given the lack of progress we've seen even since Paris. That's a median of 1.8 degrees, so way above 1.5, but not quite at 2. And this is all based on governments, etc., keeping to their policies. But even recently, there's more and more information coming out that behind the scenes, there's a lot happening that was cause of concern. So even this last week, The Guardian had an expose that a lot of the oil and gas companies are actually developing projects to extract more fossil fuels, which would, I think, by the figures they came up with, would be equivalent to another China. So again, it's not clear what will happen, but it's not looking good. And I think we can say that even if we're optimistic, it's not looking good. And I'm more pessimistic given what we've seen so far. So given these huge threats to biodiversity from climate change and the potential large amount of climate change we're facing over the next few decades, I want to address the idea is the way we do conservation now fit for the future? And I'm going to caricature conservation here, which would probably irritate some of you. And I'm sure some of you say, well, actually, it's not like that. There are other things. But I'm going to do that just to set up a bit of a straw man to have a go at. So if you look at traditional conservation, as people do it on the ground, as policy people do it, as a lot of NGOs do it, we focus a lot on preventing extinctions. We focus a lot on rare species and habitats and that have declined recently. And something I work on a lot is restoration. And that's focused a lot on historical target ecosystems with, as I showed you earlier, that diagram or that map of what we've lost in Dorset. And so a restoration approach would be to try to get back some of those ecosystems we've lost. And a way of thinking about that is a sort of a looking to the past for what we aim at in conservation. Now the question is, if we do that, and this is what this dam is supposed to illustrate, if we do that, are we building up a problem for the future? Are we sort of holding back change now, but this future climate change is building up against this dam of conservation we have and starting to break through? And to take an example, if we conserve species where they are, but climate change is sweeping away where they can, their ability to live there, what does that mean for how we do conservation? So that's the issue I want to address for the rest of the talk. And to emphasize as well, the future is hugely uncertain. I've touched on that already. So one thing is, often when we talk about conservation under climate change, you see projections of, as I showed you earlier, under this amount of climate change, this will happen in terms of where species can live. But climate change is continual, especially under the more extreme climate change scenarios. We're seeing, I don't know if people can see my cursor. Can someone nod? You can. We're seeing climate change continuing to the end of the century and probably beyond. It's plateauing out under some of the less extreme. So where do we fix our endpoint for climate change? That's a big issue. We have uncertainty in our climate change projections, and that's through a number of things, but even within our models, we have uncertainty. So the first tier of uncertainty here is that what scenario we're looking at. These are the RCPs, the different climate change trajectories. We have lots of different models we use to look at climate change, and we have different runs of these models. So all of those, even within a certain scenario, lead to huge uncertainty about what we'll actually see. And this is the global mean temperature, which is probably the most robust thing we can do. If we look at what might happen in the UK or in Dorset, the uncertainty is even greater. And we're really uncertain in predicting biodiversity responses. This is a really nice paper by Mark Urban a few years ago, where he looked at a large number of projections of species extinctions under climate change and fitted this nice curve. He drew some conclusions. But what I wanted to use this figure to illustrate is each of these bubbles or dots is a different study, and the size is the number of species they looked at. But you can see even within one aspect of climate change, a certain amount of temperature change globally, you see a huge range of projections of extinction rate from virtually nothing, say let's take this one, up to 40%. And that's again because we still are really unable to totally understand how individual species or groups of species will react to climate change. So that uncertainty has to be part of our planning. And a denialist would say, oh, well, we don't know, so well, let's just leave it and see what happens. But given this uncertainty and the fact that we're already seeing change under climate change, we need to react to that, but factor in this uncertainty. So this is a summary from a paper Charlie Gardner and I published, was it this year or last year? I can't remember now, on what might we do differently if we want to really act on the reality of climate-driven biotic change, as we put it in a fancy way, act on the reality of climate-driven change. And we contrasted more traditional conservation with what we called survival ecology. And we drew a number of, I guess, differences that one may want to think about. So we characterized conservation as aiming to maintain the diversity of life, or i.e. maximizing the species persistence in the short term. And for what we call survival ecology, we wondered whether we have to accept that some species, and maybe a large number of species, are going to go extinct under climate change. And we need to maintain the conditions for complex life in the future, and that should be an aim. And I'll go into a bit more detail because that might sound a bit weird, what exactly we mean by that. We said maybe the approach of conservation is seeking to prevent or reverse this biotic change I've just described. And maybe what we need to do is be more proactive and accept this reality and seek to shape the outcomes. And I mentioned this to someone in a conservation group, and they said, yeah, we're starting to do that. So I'm not saying this isn't happening. And just in case you start getting enraged, I think people are starting to think about this, and I'm not proposing a unique take on this, but really just saying, let's think about what this proactive approach might look like. The priorities of conservation are prioritizing present diversity, and a lot of people criticize conservation for this in different ways, about focusing on threatened species and the places currently harboring rich biodiversity. And maybe again, we need to think about not so much diversity, but future functioning ecosystems, functioning landscapes, and what that means in terms of how we do conservation and restoration. And key actions at the bottom here, you'll see some are the same. So it's not to say we throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't stop what we're doing, but we seek to start adapting what we're doing. So certainly we need protected areas, but there are a range of approaches which people are already talking about starting to put in place. But there are some maybe more controversial ones about creating novel ecosystems, a rewilding. And one thing which I know less about, and I'm not going to talk about any more, but what do we do to facilitate species adapting to climate change, or even allowing new speciation or facilitating new speciation as we lose more and more species by extinction? That's something to throw into the mix here, but I won't really return to. So I'm going to think about a couple of approaches that people have talked about for quite some time, and which might be part of this new approach to how we do conservation under climate change. One of those is an interesting area of assisted colonisation or assisted migration, which is interesting because it's something that not that long ago was a lot of people were really concerned about and said, how is it going to work? It's madness, whatever. But now it's becoming more and more talked about. The general idea is, as where species are living becomes unsuitable for them under a current climate, under a future climate, sorry, should we move them to new areas? Should we translocate them? And There's a lot of talk about that. There's this nice paper a few years ago about what that might look like. And I'm sure already you can think of the huge number of risks and concerns there. I think if we take those as read, I think there are a number of issues with how it's thought about now. And a big one is it's often species level. So given there are an estimated 8.1 million species on the planet, how do we decide, how are we going to move all of those? Which ones are we going to move? Is it just going to be the charismatic megafauna we move? That's something that concerns me. And this paper thinks a bit about working out which species are most at risk and where do we move them and how do we move them. I think another issue here is the uncertainty I mentioned. How do we estimate which are at risk? And also that continual nature of climate change. If we move them to one spot, a few decades or a decade later, that may no longer be suitable. So what do we do? So I would say we probably need a more generic and generalizable approach to that. And maybe it's to do with going back to connectivity, which obviously is something landscape ecologists are very interested in. And do we facilitate connectivity in general to allow species to move? And that connectivity is a sort of standard landscape ecology approach is what we call structural connectivity, by building corridors, etc., to allow species to move. But another aspect is actually facilitating the movement itself by a classic idea is if we have animals moving around the landscape, they may disperse seeds. But even humans themselves can help species move indirectly by transport pathways, etc. So that's what I mean by connectivity. In the technical terms, it's structural and I've forgotten the other word now. Structural, functional, structural and functional connectivity. I've got it. But I'll try not to use too many buzz phrases. But yeah, okay, so we've got the 3 patches of habitat. And we build corridors between them. I've got this dark green one because I think one aspect we often forget about the connectivity is that different species live in different types of habitats. So we don't need the same habitat everywhere. It can be slightly different to allow species. That's a slight aside here. So we have these sort of corridors, but also I think another area we don't think about enough is creating permeable landscapes. So that's what this green thing means, is that we create landscapes which species can move through more easily than these hard industrial landscapes we see, especially some like Britain. So it's creating more general permeability. Also, we need to scale these up. So we need to link up different areas by maybe corridors and that permeability, and do that more and more, creating new patches, creating new links, etc. So we start seeing something like that. And I've just to highlight, we're looking at corridors in this project here. Do corridors work? Which if you Google that, you'll find our website. We're actually trying to work out something we know very little about, really. Do animals actually use wildlife corridors? We're trying to look into that. But that's the sort of idea. So we create landscapes which species hopefully can move through more easily rather than start picking up individual species and moving them around. And it's a slight aside here. This is not a connected landscape. It's a landscape with lots of hedgerows in it. And I always get irritated when people say, oh, hedgerows, they connect to landscapes. Evidence is they don't. Anyway, to move that from my bugbear there. And how do we then think about large scales? So this is a rather ill-looking Great Britain, but just a caricature of Britain with lots of little, well, actually large, but I mean little patches of habitat. And how do we link those up? Well, we start thinking about large-scale connectivity. And I've drawn this specially to avoid HS2 line, because I don't believe HS2, despite the hype, is providing that connectivity. I think that is a greenwash they're doing. But one could start thinking about linking up over very large scales. And I've done this purposely broad. I mean, this is massively broad, but again, it needs to be ambitious and large scale, not a few hedgerows and calling that connectivity. And What about Britain is an island. Obviously, we only have a limited number of species here, and especially the south warms, are species going to be no longer able to live there? Probably. So where do the species come from that might live in those areas? Again, we could purposely transcreate species with all the problems I mentioned. Can human trade, etc., facilitate international connectivity? That's what I've got here. And I've got a map here, which is obviously out of date. You can see loads of goods coming out of Russia when we did this, which is, I think, no longer happening. You never know. And this was a paper where we actually looked at invasions. And this is, of course, the big problem people come up with, unsurprisingly, when one thinks about, can we facilitate international connectivity, maybe through trade routes and other things, that people start worrying about aliens and non-natives, and that's a valid concern. If we start doing this sort of thing, do we create a rod for our own backs of having damaging invasives coming in? But again, there's that flip side. How do we facilitate the movement of species into this country to maintain functioning ecosystems as climate change progresses? So another area I want to talk about is, I mentioned complexity and functioning, which a lot of people do as rather buzzwords, which all sound really good, but what do they mean? And this is some work we've been doing recently to try to bottom out what that means. So if we prioritize the maintenance of complex and functional ecosystems, that sounds great, sounds like something like a government policy. We did some work looking at the theory behind this to actually work out what that might mean. So a lot of people are saying, oh, complexity is good. Complexity is a fantastic thing. And actually we boiled it down, and rather strangely, we came up with a rather simple definition of complexity. We said it is the number of components in a system and the number of connections among them. And in that simplicity is hidden some complexity. So the components could be species. So we have more species and they interact more by predation, by competition, by above below ground interactions. We get more complexity, but could also be to the structure of the system. So the vegetation, height, classes, openness, etc. The number of groups of types of species, so-called functional groups, and the number of habitats across a landscape. Those can all be the components, and we can think of many more. Connections can include species interactions, as I've said. So we get more complex food webs, more complex interaction webs. Basically, we've got more of those interactions and more cross linkages. It can also be energy flows among species. So as we get energy goes to different parts of the ecosystem or the landscape, that is another aspect of complexity. And also this scales up, as I said, to landscape, so more connectivity amongst habitat patches. And we illustrate it in this diagram that at the extreme end, you've got this could be a landscape or it could be an ecosystem. Let's call it an ecosystem. So here you have all the species the same. It's just one species. It's a field of ryegrass. There are no connections amongst them. And therefore it has no connection, no complexity. And I'll talk about the emergent properties in a minute. But as we start getting more components, we start getting more complexity. As we start getting more connections between those components, we get more and more complexity there. So that's what we mean by complexity. And by doing that, we can start thinking about it as an aim for what we do. And the reason we're thinking about that is this ecological complexity does link to a number of desirable properties of a system, be that an ecosystem or a landscape. Ecological complexity links to ecosystem functions. So ecosystem functions, sorry to get into lots of definitions here, but this is defined as the flow of energy and materials through a system. So to put that into more simple terms, it's about the capture of the sun's energies by plants and its redistribution through the system. It's the efficiency of the decomposition networks. It's how predation happens in the system. And all those lead to functions, and if you're interested, onto ecosystem services. Complexity also links to resilience. So resilience being the ability of the system to withstand perturbations such as drought or storms, or even humans doing things like cutting down trees. And there are other, we call these emergent properties. There are a number of other things which I won't go into at the moment, but the complexity is a great hub around which to organize these ideas. And this is the evidence, just to mention a couple of papers here where we've shown how these aspects of complexity do link to functions. This isn't purely conjecture. There is a lot of evidence in the literature of how species richness links to productivity, or patchiness links to pollination processes, and how resilience also links to things like heterogeneity of a system or connectivity. So there's a lot of evidence there which we can build on. And so what does this mean? Well, one way we're thinking about this is restoration. And restoration, again, this is a bit of a caricature of restoration, but it's really captured in the Society for Ecological Restoration, their recent guidance on restoration, where the idea of restoration is very much about you have a degraded system, such as you can see on the top row here, and the aim of restoration is getting it back towards a target so-called native ecosystem that we feel has been lost from the area or we think is valuable to recreate. So it's very much based on identity, and a lot of restoration is about how you get it back towards that identity. And what our idea here is actually, what we want to do is restore ecological complexity at multiple scales. So it's not necessarily to do with identity, it's to do with those aspects of diversity, connectivity, and complexity. And so one can do that, as I said, at the ecosystem level or the landscape level, and ideally both. So combine those two sorts of things. So one way that would play out in reality is you're restoring different types of ecosystem at the landscape scale to create the heterogeneity and complexity there. And we've captured these thoughts in this paper you can see here. And that might all sound really airy-fairy and conceptual, but in this project and what we laid out in the paper, and the project you can see here just the top right, Rest Reco. Again, if you Google that, you'll find a website about what we're doing. And we've said, look, there are ways in which you can measure complexity and ways in which your restoration complexity will differ from more traditional approaches. So having a diversity of approach to restoration, where you may want to move to more natural processes. And certainly when we're setting targets, we're not saying, oh, look, there's a nice calcareous grassland. We're saying it's a complex grassland or low herb system, but which doesn't resemble anything we've seen before. We also want to take adaptive approaches where we start intervening if we think it's not going the right way, and we start doing things like we're actually looking at some things experimentally. Like in our woodland part of the Rest Reco, we're looking at adding things like dead wood to move it onwards and increase the complexity. And key thing here is large scale. Too much of what we do is small scale and unambitious. And I'm getting short on time, so just to give a couple of examples of some maybe non-traditional examples of restoring complexity. Here you might expect to see a woodland, but we're seeing a nice complex scrub community. Here you might expect to see a calcareous grassland, but we're seeing a nice tall weed community with the hedgerows growing out. And to finish off, just to flag up rewilding, which is, I'm not saying is the approach, but maybe one key approach for future restoration, because it brings together some of these ideas. We have this assisted colonisation, although I think we need to focus on the function of species we bring in rather than their charisma. I'll leave that hanging. But also, again, this is addressed in a paper a couple of years ago, aspects of rewilding bring together some of these ideas: connectivity, complexity, large scale, and resilience, which are captured in these diagrams, and I won't go into any more detail here. I think to do this, we need to seriously free up space. I know in Britain, the Environment Bill is talking about freeing up space, but I think this is a really nice report that was sort of somewhat buried, but it was done for the government, the Dimble report, where they showed we could actually free up a lot of space, possibly for nature, if we do a number of things like we farm better, we waste less food, we eat less meat, and by these calculations, they came up with 30% less land could be used to feed the same number of people. And that third less land could be used for other things, such as helping nature respond to climate change. So, in conclusion, I hope I've emphasized that Earth and nature does face a climate emergency, which maybe will force us to rethink conservation goals. What I've tried to think about here is how do we seek to rather than seeking to maintain a world which no longer exists, we start to think about what we can shape for biodiversity in the world to come. This needs to take account of huge uncertainty, and maybe we focus on complexity, well-functioning, resilient ecosystems, which would benefit hopefully a range of species and humans. I haven't talked about ecosystem services, but that's implicit in it all. But there are some controversial aspects about how we reconsider distribution of species, including non-natives, creating novel ecosystems, and as I mentioned, even thinking about facilitating speciation. And I think the main aim I've done here is there's an urgent need for debate on how to conserve biodiversity in this rapidly changing world. I don't pretend to have come up with the answers, but hopefully stimulate some debate. And that's me done. Thank you very much.